everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. There's a prevailing narrative that philosophy is dead and science killed it. The story goes something like this. Philosophy was necessary when there were big questions we couldn't answer. But now our expansive scientific knowledge can explain most things, and our technologically refined scientific methods will figure out the rest. There's no longer a need to grow huge beards, wear togas, and ponder in the town square. Today we're going to look at why that's not true. Well, all of it except the part about togas. And while science has continually claimed the territory of philosophy, philosophy hasn't disappeared, but instead has pressed on into new unknowns. Alright, so science and philosophy. This is one that gets talked about a lot, especially if you're on the philosophy side of it. If you're on the science side of it, a lot of people don't really think about philosophy, which, as we'll talk about a little bit later, doesn't mean that philosophy doesn't exist in science, but it's more latent or built into it than it used to be. It's not as explicit. On the philosophy side of it, it gets talked about a lot, especially in higher education, where people say, well, philosophy departments aren't necessary anymore, or that sort of thing. Or you tell somebody you're doing a philosophy podcast, and this has actually happened to me. Oh, you do a podcast? What's it about? Oh, it's about philosophy. Oh, is that like astrology? No.
That's sweet.
But yeah, so I mean, there's just, there is some prevailing ignorance about what philosophy even is.
Sure.
And I think that leads to some of the discussion about why or if philosophy is dead, is because there's almost a misunderstanding about what philosophy even is or what it does. So let's jump right into it, and I'll ask you outright, why does science need philosophy?
Science needs philosophy, whether some practitioners believe it or not, and some very much do. In the sense that science can't avoid philosophy. Philosophy is among so many other things, asking large questions, some of them embracing an ambiguity, some of them questions that clearly aren't going to be answered immediately, but questions which push one forward. And when one believes that one has abandoned or killed or found it totally useless, one is missing the very underlying act that one is doing. Now, I'm stepping out on a limb with this because here I am, retired professor, always professor, of a small community college. I have 2 master's degrees. I taught virtually my entire adult life. But I'm not a big gun in science or philosophy. I know that there's a necessary humility to all of this. So when I say that Richard Feynman was blowing smoke out of his hat when he was trashing philosophy, well, Feynman was one of the people whose writings I still continue to learn from. When Stephen Hawking essentially declares philosophy dead, well, Stephen Hawking was brilliant, but he was human. And I miss things, and he misses things. He probably missed fewer things than I. But I think that it's an act of intellectual blindsidedness or arrogance to assume that philosophy isn't part of science.
Right, and that's a really good example is highlighting those guys, because like you said, titans in science, and you and I are just 2 guys talking in a in a bedroom studio.
And I'm glad we are.
So yeah, and again, we are obviously approaching any topic, but especially a topic of hard science, from a place of this is what we think based off of what we know.
Yes.
And when when these scientists say that philosophy is dead, they're saying what they think based off of what they know.
And thankfully, not all scientists say it.
Right. But I guess, so if we're looking at that, so why does science need philosophy? I guess we need to talk about what role philosophy plays in science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of providing a logical fabric to what's being put into data, right? What the data is saying.
Yeah.
So, Hawking and Feynman, these guys had big scientific discoveries, but really, if you're looking at it, you're looking at data of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And the data, it's there, but philosophy is sort of determining what story the data is telling you, right?
Yes, the conceptual structure. Philosophy partly is about recognizing that all things change or seem to. But how do they change? And do they really? And if they do, how come? Those kind of questions are laced into the very foundation as science emerged from philosophy.
And so I think Hawking is a really good example, right? Because Hawking made leaps in the field of studying black holes. But up until our most recent direct imaging of a black hole, there was still speculation about whether black holes even existed.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are a quantum physicist, your position would be that black holes don't exist. And so a quantum physicist and Stephen Hawking, they might be looking at some different data sets, but what they're not doing is saying that certain data doesn't exist. So both of those people are looking at data, but they're coming to different conclusions because of their interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they have different philosophies about what's happening at these gravitational points.
That's it. Yes.
So for somebody like Hawking to say that philosophy is dead when there's people in his field looking at his same data and coming to different conclusions really demonstrates that regardless of what his opinion was, philosophy is not dead, even in his very own subject.
Even in his very own subject. This is one of the current scientists, another big gun, so to speak, Carlo Rovelli. I love reading his work. He is a physicist of the first order, acknowledged, awarded, and so on. And I follow his blog, and he's written on this topic as well as many others, and he doesn't trash his fellow scientists. He's always taking the more positive and gentle and inclusive view, which I appreciate about him. And he, in his various writings, he has pointed out in many ways in which philosophy is inextricable. For instance, in one of the blogs from around 2015, 16, it was fairly recent. Anyway, he says, well, okay, but let's go back to the beginning. Here we have a philosopher named, it's often pronounced Isocrates, who has a school, and in it he's teaching the practicality of things and looking at the only things of worth are the practical applications. And then we have Plato. Now, socio-politically, culturally, and so on, there are all kinds of problematic, male, imperialistic, everything built into this. But if I tease out some of the things, because I think there's still value in the observations, where we see the same conflict, the clash of schools, so to speak, way back thousands of years ago that we have now. And in education, as you well know, with the training that you've received, the abundance of privilege goes to only those things that are seen to have immediate applications and worth. Thus, the humanities are in constant state of trying to stay on life support, so to speak, in institutions of higher learning. despite the fact that one it's been done many times, make all kinds of arguments for why the humanities give one a healthier life, a better life, and so on and so on.
Yeah, because look at the word. If you're trying to take the humanity out of the other subjects that you're studying, it's not a very fulfilling, not a very fulfilling thing.
No.
But okay, so looking back at the kind of the formation of philosophy, you're right. So you had Plato, who's kind of metaphysic in a lot of, and he covered the gambit, but there's a lot of metaphysical aspects to it. And then you had Aristotelian, sort of epistemological observation of things.
Yep.
So, looking at that, do you think that science has always existed, or do you think at some point there was only philosophy?
Well, the teachers who influenced me and the writings who influenced me have made a very strong case where there was philosophy, and the questions of philosophy were targeted at things that we then we call scientific. Where do we come from, and how does the world work, and those kind of things. Yeah.
Right. So, gotcha. So whenever we're looking at something, a philosophy, I guess we should define it, right? Mm-hmm. So what's the difference between having a philosophy, right? And, you're looking at the world, right? And you're trying to determine how things happen. What makes something a philosophy?
You're looking a structural approach to things. So it's not a cascade of random questions as much as it is a question that leads to another question that leads to another question, that much like what we do in the podcast. We're always referencing things we've talked about before. If you don't want to think of it as a cascade, then we can use a more current structural paradigm, which is the web,
right?
Interwovenness, which is nice. But Aristotle was working with was founding the notion that a general theory of something goes on and supports and happens to be useful to the development of science. But you start with the idea of theory. How does the mind work? What is the mind? How do we determine what the mind is? Can we conceptualize something and then test it? So to me, there's an obvious interrelationship between the two things. In fact, it's the same genetic code, so to speak, for philosophy and science. Because if you're just taking raw data, we are so data obsessed. I think this is familiar to you. I mean, in the work that I did, if you didn't hear multiple times every day, well, what do the data show? What do the data show? Well, here's the raw information. But how is that information gathered? What were the questions that were asked in order to obtain that information? Were there skewings of some way in that information? So let's say you've got this information. If you just treat that information as untainted, whether it's numbers or anecdotal material, then you're missing the point of how the information was obtained in the first place. So there's already an inescapable essence of the human and the flawed in that information, which doesn't mean the information is wrong. It just means that as one is making guesses about the information and then building theory and then drawing conclusions and applying those, one is still bringing a foundational approach to it.
Right, and that's a problem in modern science or academia, right? Is looking at, if you find people who have good writing skills, you might read through a study, and some people, if you're not applying a critical reading approach to it, you might just sort of accept what the results of a study are. Mm-hmm. Or there's a lot of students that will just read the abstract and then read the discussion and be done with it. Mm-hmm. But it takes philosophy is reading through the methods, and then lots of times you can read through the methods and spot limitations that the authors don't mention at the end of it. And then that makes you question, okay, like you said, well, how was this data, how was this collected? Is it being interpreted in a way that accurately reflects what the author is concluding from it, and all of these other things? And it leads to, problems in academia where they have problems replicating studies because maybe some of those things weren't done right, or maybe the demographic that was drawn from was different, or all these different things. So I think that a big risk in saying philosophy is dead is that you see what people reacting the way they are now, which is people will read a scientific article in the news and say, well, this is the way it is.
Yes.
Well,
or reject it and say, nope, this is
right.
This is patently untrue. Based on what? There were some Ravelli or someone referred, I can't remember who, but they're essentially saying, well, then you're back down to two old guys sitting on a bench and they hear something about the world and, well, that's not true. Why? Because I never experienced it. Or,
right.
So you said the word method, and I think that's vitally important. Philosophy is about methods.
Mm-hmm.
And people who caricature it or poo-poo it, toss it aside, like to pretend reductively that it's two old guys sitting on a bench asking random questions, but they're not random questions. There's a method to question asking.
Right.
And I, even if you watch a police procedural, which is a scripted drama, but then you will see a set of questions that sooner or later take information, and sometimes what the information was, just in a silly, fun police or detective show or whatever, a mystery. Oh, I thought this meant this. No, it doesn't mean this at all. We were looking for this problem. That's not the problem we should be looking for. And I love mysteries for those kind of things. But that's philosophical.
Right. Yeah, and that's what my wife's uncle is a lawyer. And he's told me, that's what law school is. Law school, they're not teaching you about the law. They're teaching you how to think. Because the law is so expansive that they couldn't possibly go over everything in the law or every possible scenario you might run into. What they're saying is, here's the basics of it. Here's how you should try to interpret procedures. But outside of that, here's how you have to think in order to apply those procedures to whatever situation you might come across. Mm-hmm. And that's philosophy. That's what you're being taught is logic, right? And logic is
it's one of the schools,
right?
Branches.
So, looking at that, we'll ask the inverse question from the first one: why does philosophy need science?
All right, and it's a fine question. Philosophy needs science because whether we live in a culture that likes to acknowledge or admit this or eschew it, science is essentially the producer of almost all things that we have been philosophizing about. Whether it's advances in human health or ways of approaching human health, to the creation of technologies and whether we should apply them or not. I can think of almost nothing that hasn't the essence of science to it in some way that philosophy addresses. Philosophy needs science because science is the practical application of method. And so one can, as they like to caricature, sitting in an armchair talking about things instead of actually putting your feet on the ground and doing something. Oh, okay, well, let's run with that. I can ask really fine questions from an armchair that aren't wrong because they were generated from a couch. But I'm not, as you said before, I'm not an engineer. I am not a technologist. I am well read and I'm wide on those kinds of things from a layperson viewpoint. But if a technologist or an engineer or a physicist designs an experiment, and all of that may be way beyond me, and somebody like Ravelli is going to explain to me what's really going on there, and maybe I'll have half a notion of understanding, I still get to ask questions, and those questions sometimes will be relevant, and those questions sometimes might lead somebody who's listening to rethink what they're doing, which is what the essence of. I'm not trying to talk about me today. It's on Me Day. I don't know why I'm doing this, but I guess coming up on an anniversary. I tried in my teaching with my students to always come to them as a writing instructor or as a philosophy teacher to say, I have a body of knowledge. I can teach you, as you just said about the law, so to speak, I can teach you to question. I can teach you to ask questions that will lead you to write things that you wouldn't have thought you would have written. I can teach you to question what people tell you about what makes good writing, because often those cliches just aren't the case. But I can't tell you whether your engineering problem that you're solving in another class is right. I can't tell you if you've done the proper procedure as a nurse when you're inserting an IV, because that's not my body of knowledge, because we are a society that embraces speciality, as the British say. So my specialty is not yours. However, my specialty can assist yours, and your specialty can in turn cause me to rethink, which assists mine.
Gotcha. So philosophy needs science because, without that rigor, without that sort of a practical application, what do you have? Can science exist without philosophy and vice versa? Do you think they can exist in voids without each other?
I really don't think so, because they never have.
Right.
I don't want to obsess about ancient origins, but I think it's inevitable that when you ask questions, you put them to a test. If you put them to a test and you gather information, however that is done across centuries and cultures, then you have perhaps a result or a dead end. At which point you're asking all kinds of questions again to try to figure out, well, what's next, or what went wrong, or why would this lead to this, and practical stuff. How is this useful? How might this be applied? But if you don't have any of that going on, then the questions are going to be fascinating questions. And some of them are going to be fascinating questions no matter what scientists do. But for the most part, there is an interwovenness. Look at our culture now. We have scientists, world-class scientists, presenting us information that has, to some extent, changed because of intensive research of a kind that the planet, on a planetary basis, has never been done before for the pandemic, for COVID-19 solutions. And within a year, this is unprecedented, within a year, we have multiple inoculations, multiple vaccines. Oh, but it's been discovered that there might be a problem with one, and there has been for a very, very small number of people. So it's something like 6 cases out of 7 million. I've forgotten for the moment which one. It doesn't matter which one, I think, at this moment. So people say, no, we got to stop it. We can't do this. There's too much of a risk. Well, if you apply mathematical science, statistical, and you say, okay, I worked that out as I did on the calculator, and I can't give you the exact number out of my memory, but it was something like 0.0000085%. Not even close to any minuscule. Now, those human lives who have suffered or died, those handful of people, were valuable and human, and the loss is therefore irreparable and to be mourned. But does that mean an entire policy should change? Probably not. But that requires both a philosophical approach and scientific rigor.
Right, and that's a big philosophical issue is determining where science starts and ends, right? And you have all these levels of sigma, right?
Mhm.
Sigma levels determining how certain you are that something actually is science, right?
Mhm.
And so, with something like the numbers you're talking about, well, we only have a 5 sigma certainty. Well, only a 5 sigma certainty can be very, very certain. But it's still a philosophical question, right? Because people are going to look at it and say, well, wait, if we have this number of people dying, then it's not working and we need to redo it. But so I want to go back to the original question though, because I'm not quite clear on it. So we'll practice some philosophy.
Okay.
Could science and philosophy exist in voids, right? Let's kind of question back and see where we go if we get far enough
All right.
back. So if we have philosophy, which is sort of the asking questions in a process, having a process to ask questions without a practical application, is there another word for that? Is there another sort of concept that we could consider that? I'll tell you what I'm getting.
I'm at a loss.
All right. So let's say we have, for instance, something that couldn't be concretely looked at, like epicycles, right? Ptolemy, I think it was Ptolemy had the epicycles.
Yep.
Humanity was trying to espouse the philosophy that the Earth is at the middle of the universe.
Yes.
And so in order to do that, they were observing the stars. And of course, Earth is not at the middle of the universe, much less the center of the solar system. So as a result, the planets were not acting the way they wanted them to.
Mm-hmm.
So what they were doing was saying, well, in addition to the planets going around the Earth, the planets are actually making small circles as they're on their larger orbit around the Earth. And the more more observations they took, the less it worked. So the more epicycles they created, on and on and on. So in that case, you had a philosophy. I guess that's still science and philosophy, but the philosophy was wrong, right? You think?
The philosophy was partially wrong in the sense that there were circles, but there wasn't enough knowledge yet to determine how those circles would work.
Right.
So the questions were important. The tools by which to gain the information to address those questions and assumptions and conclusions had to be developed. There's that philosophy needs science.
Right.
Okay. And science needed philosophy because if science had said, well, Earth is at the center of the solar system, there are 5 planets, and there's the end of the story. And the philosopher says, what if there's a 6th? Shouldn't we try to look and find out? and so that's where science needs philosophy. Right.
So if we have that wasn't a good example. Philosophy without science.
Okay. All right. Yes.
Would that be like a conspiracy theory?
Okay. In the sense of how? I mean,
well, because here's what I'm thinking. So a lot of conspiracy theorists, if you read the conspiracies, there appears to be a logical train of thought, and there appears to be a question among question, but there's no rigorous or
Right. It appears because conspiracy theories are another kind of religious faith.
Mm.
Now, again, as I've said time and time again, I am not trashing religious faith because I have far too many people in my life who I honor, and they have various kinds of faith systems, which are part of their lives, but do not dominate their capacity to think. Q and all of these related conspiracies, or the fictional ones, the X-Files stuff, take whatever you will. They pretend to be philosophical, because they pretend to ask questions, but they aren't, because they already think they have the answers. They pretend to consider information, which they don't, because they're trying to shoehorn information into a pattern that they've already are absolutely certain exists. So when you're coy when you say, "Well, oh, look, there's a pattern here. This number and this number added together make 7."
Right.
Okay. I'm shocked. You see, there's that 7 or that 13 again. That's nonsense, because what they're doing is pushing the issue to find what it is that they want to find.
So the difference between a conspiracy and a philosophy is deductive versus inductive reasoning. If you're starting with a premise, you're starting with an end result that you believe is true, and then you're just finding evidence that supports that notion. That's a conspiracy. Whereas a philosophy is starting without having the answer in mind and asking questions to try to box in what the answer may be.
I will go with you with that to a point, but I will even say still that no, conspiracy theories are not philosophy. Because in deductive reasoning, you take what's there and you can't start out being certain of what your conclusion is going to be, either in deductive or inductive reasoning, and say that you're actually doing logical work.
Right.
So there's where the irrational is. And there's where the faith is. Because faith is not rational either. And that doesn't mean everybody's wandering around being irrational. It just means that you've already decided what the answers are. And so you're not really looking for fresh thought. Now, that's not true for every branch of every religion, and certainly not. I'm trying desperately not to overgeneralize. But in the main, if you accept absolutely that the unseen is there, and that no matter what you question, the unseen is the answer, then the question becomes less and less and less important.
Okay, so I guess I'm trying to think of any other examples where philosophy could exist without science. Right?
Well, if science is logic, no. If science is, but I can sit here and say, what is the nature of God? And that is, it seems like it's not a scientific question, because you can't prove God exists, you can't prove God doesn't. Descartes, everyone else, how many people have worked on that? But if you say, what is the nature of God? You are asking or assuming, and then asking, that there is a categorizable set of elements and characteristics that comprise a figure called God. So even if I'm asking a question like that, if I break down the way that I phrase the question, there's still an element of science in it.
Right. And ultimately, it kind of comes down to it's language again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because to say, to like how you just said that, trying to say that there is God or isn't God is not a scientific question, but talking about the nature of God
is a scientific approach.
And so really the language that goes into determining, well, what do we mean by God then is kind of is its own philosophical and scientific question. So let's look at the inverse one.
Okay.
Can science exist without philosophy? I'll present you a scenario.
Okay.
All right. And I guess this could be pretty feasible. Let's say we have an artificial intelligence, right? And it's gathering all kinds of data, right? We have the Large Sky Survey. So it looks at, the whole sky every so often and, maps where things are.
Yeah.
Is that doing science without philosophy? If it's not human, right? It's collecting massive troves of data, and it may even be able to draw some inferences from that data without being conscious or sentient.
But if it's,
and here we go with the language again.
Yeah, right. I'm good. And I appreciate you expressed that very well, truly. but my philosophical question is, how would it be possible to develop an intelligence that does not have the taint or the essence or the conceptual structures of the human, because we're the ones making it.
Right.
And so there are built-in, just like we know there are built-in, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, into the so-called simplest algorithms. Don't ask me to write an algorithm. I'm talking philosophically. but biases that are built in, sometimes with intent and sometimes because they just seem to be transparent, until philosophically we start asking the questions about those biases and make them not transparent anymore, and make them reveal them. So in the artificial intelligence case, looking at the big sky or the deep sky, we are asking, we have, I don't want to use the word trained because we have programmed, written the coding for that gathering of information. And that coding is based on anything that we think we might be looking for. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it does. So the AI is built by humans, and as a result, the information that it's collecting is what humans consider important. So it really makes no difference to the universe if there's a giant stadium-sized asteroid about to hit Earth. It doesn't make any difference.
No, it doesn't make any difference.
But to humans, it makes a big amount of difference. So they've created this AI in order to collect the information that they consider important.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is philosophical in nature.
There was a multi-talented, a polymath, a man named Otto Neurath, who died in the 40s. He was Austrian. He was a philosopher. He's an economist. He was all kinds of things. A sociologist. He innovated isotope statistical work. He did all kinds of things. And his articulation of the relationship between science, I think you're going to like this, and philosophy went right back to refreshing a model that we've talked about over and over again. He went back to the ship of Theseus. So I'm going to read you a quotation from him. All right. So Otto Neurath. Imagine sailors who, far out at sea, transform the shape of their clumsy vessel from a more circular to a more fish-like one. They make use of some drifting timber, besides the timber of the old structure, to modify the skeleton and hull of their vessel, but they cannot put the ship in dock in order to start from scratch. During their work, they stay on the old structure and deal with heavy gales and thundering waves, and in transforming their ship, they take care that dangerous leakages do not occur. A new ship grows out of the old one step by step, and while they are still building, the sailors may already be thinking of a new structure, and they will not always agree with one another, and the whole business will go on in a way that we cannot even anticipate today. That is our fate. I've been watching a television show called Away. It's on Netflix, and it's near future science fiction. It's about the first mission to Mars. And the episode that I just watched was about the water system catastrophically breaking down on this tin can going to Mars with 5 people on it. And of course, the emotional, the human conflict is one, and they have essentially a spare tire device, which will only produce half as much water. It'll be enough for them to survive. But they have to deconstruct the entire system. And then when they put it back together, then they realize that if they had taken apart one of the other parts, they might have had full water. I suspect the show being what it is, they're still going to have things better happen to them. But they go through all of this, and I'm sitting there thinking, Neurath. I'm thinking the ship of Theseus. The moment you start tinkering with the vessel that you're on, it's not the same vessel anymore, is it? The more you tinker, the more you must, because you realize things. That's what science does. The ship of Theseus is a philosophical model, but Neurath, I think, was right. It embraces or expresses the inextricable relationship between the two things. You can, I mean, you're not, if you're on a ship and somebody says, well, gee, what if we poke a hole here? Maybe more water will go out than comes in. The science-oriented people on the ship are saying, you're crazy, we're not putting another hole in the bottom of the ship, but we have to find another way to blah, 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 which is the scientific method in a sense.
Right. Yeah, and we've talked about that before where, like anybody who's a homeowner has run into this, right? You have to make a minor repair of some kind, and you open something up, and it's not what you expect would be there. Mm-hmm. And then you have to trace back the logic. Sometimes you tear the whole thing apart. You go, what were these guys thinking? You tear it apart and go, oh, wait, they had it that way for a reason.
Yeah.
Or sometimes you tear it apart and you go, well, why did they have it that way? Because it makes more sense to do it this way. Well, the people that built it originally didn't have the methods. Construction and stuff.
And the materials.
That's philosophical. Looking at a problem, something that you don't expect, and then trying to determine, well, is it this way for a purpose, or was it this way because the knowledge and methods weren't there originally? So tinkering, is sort of inherently philosophical and scientific at the same time, and that's sort of the course of humanity, right? That's what we're doing on all fronts is looking at something and saying, okay, well, how can we make this better?
Yeah, and we have the collision of the science and the philosophical, or the blending of them, and the not scientific going on right now. And you have the confrontation between someone who is a government representative bashing the person who's in charge of the response to the pandemic by demanding to know when exactly Americans will get their freedoms back. Well, that's a loaded question. It was meant to just avoid the science entirely, as if the freedoms have gone. No, freedoms are never in. Freedoms are always in flux, people. So, and it was annoying, and you could see that the annoyance was going until one other person says, essentially, "Shut up." Well, okay, and I understand why, but that's. The point is, you can't ask for a certain answer to something that we don't have the information about yet. Just like people are complaining now, well, the vaccine, it only lasts 6 months. We don't know that because we haven't lived out the 6 months past when maybe it'll last longer. You can't ask for answers that haven't been able to be determined because of information that we don't have yet and call yourself scientific. Right. Or to call yourself philosophical if you're demanding a hard answer instead of asking a question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this happens in all areas. Even me and my wife's best friend's husband, we're both the head of different manufacturing companies. And, we've been talking about pandemic shortages and stuff, and we both have this problem, right, where, customers are so... it's results oriented, right? Mm-hmm. Everything is results oriented. And I think that as a society, that says something about us. But so him and I were both talking about how we have the same issue where customers are saying, all right, well, here's what we want. When's a hard ship date for it? And then we have to write back and say, well, if our materials come in on time, which we can't guarantee, and if we have the machine availability, which we can't guarantee because some things may be usurped for national safety purposes. And if the workforce stays healthy because there is a pandemic going on, and if you should have it this day. And then they say, okay, well, you're guaranteeing it will show up this day. Good.
Yeah, that's frustrating. Yeah, no, sir, I'm not guaranteeing it.
Right. So, and that kind of encapsulates the whole society's sort of the conundrum with the science and the philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. Is you have these people and they want, it's we've talked about it before in different areas, defining terms. Again, lots of times it comes back with language to us.
It does.
We're talking about products in this case, but it applies just as well to language. Okay, mm-hmm. Well, when I say this thing, I want it to mean this concrete thing. Well, really, there's all of these variables that go into determining whether or not what we're talking about fits into this box. And this box is not a point in space. It's a box containing several things. And that box overlaps with other boxes. And there's so trying to use one word to say, well, this is what this means becomes very difficult because words are just something that we invented. Yes. Words don't exist in the universe. And that's the whole process of philosophy, right? Is looking, observing things and trying to categorize. And then once you have a categorization that falls within your 5 or 6 sigmas, saying, well, this is science. Now it's a concrete thing.
Mm-hmm.
But science also changes.
Science
because
changes.
The philosophy changes it.
That's exactly it. There's a practicing scientist, physicist who says, currently, we gain from the new science of mind not only insights into ourselves, how we perceive, how we learn, how we remember, how we feel, how we believe, and how we act, but also a new perspective of ourselves and our fellow human beings in the context of biological evolution. We are not the same people we were yesterday. And right now we are, this, again, science and philosophy, I think, are totally mixed up into this. People are asking all these questions. People are pandemic fatigue. Well, yeah, the fatigue should be how many? 560 and more thousand. 560,000 plus people we have lost because we didn't do it as well as we might have done it. And we're trying to do it well, and everything is mitigating against that because we're tired, we're fatigued. So we just want to go back to the way it was. And we were talking about normalcy another time, right? So that's bloody dangerous. Mm-hmm. And it is leading us to the edge of perhaps another surge. Our tiredness and our desire to have everything just to be the way it was before all this hit belies an inability to, or an unwillingness to accept that the universe changes and changes and changes and changes, and there is no established, static, rendered in stone normal, no matter how much you want to push the issue. And the danger in that is then in ignoring the science and not thinking philosophically all at the same time. It becomes an understandably human, but frustratingly human, I wanna.
Right, and I think this is leading into some shows that we'll do in the future. I've been thinking about them for a while, and I think that it might be a good time here in the near future talking about some philosophical schools like Stoicism, mm-hmm. or looking at wants versus needs and how that interrelates with freedoms, right?
Sure.
Because we talk about it occasionally on the show. I was in the Army, and really, being in the Army, you have fewer freedoms or rights than prisoners in the U.S. in many cases, and that kind of opens your eyes to what sort of things you need versus what sort of things you want, and it makes the whole pandemic fatigue thing very silly in a lot of cases, right? I remember posting a picture early on in the pandemic of I had one picture of me on the right at work wearing my mask. And I picture on the left of me wearing a mask and a helmet and goggles and all my military gear. And I said, well, is going to work for 8 hours a day like this fun? No, but it's better than going to work for 12 hours a day like this, And it's perspective, right? And we've talked about perspective, and we've talked about normalcy, and we've talked about a lot of these other things.
Yeah. And,
really, in a lot of cases, that's what's required to, what people need to drive some of this home is some perspective and some philosophical thought on, well, what does it mean to have freedom? If I'm in my home and I have food to eat and I have shelter and I'm free to read or do, think or do a podcast or do, make music or write art, what more do I need? And of course, and you can't stop there because philosophy never stops. Because you should ask, well, is the government being authoritative? Are these things going on? Those are valid questions to ask, but how you come to your conclusions is the important.
That is it. Do you listen? Do you follow the line of your own solid thinking, or do you pretend to follow a line that just ends up taking you exactly where you want to be? And I mean, and what how are you cherry picking the information, and why do some things get valued and some things not? Here's science yielding empirical information. Here's an example. More people have died of gunshots in the United States in 2021. What are we in? We're not even through April. Than died in the entirety of almost 20 years in Afghanistan. More people have died of guns in this country in 3 months and a couple of weeks than 20 years of military. And yet, there are people who would say, well, yeah, so what? I have a right to have my gun. All right, well, then nobody's denying that you have a right to have a gun. But what do you make of all of this? And how can you bloody well ignore it and call yourself a rational person? There is an inescapable, problematic, culturally wide problem going on here.
Yeah, and again, it's philosophy forcing you to shift your perspective on it, and that's a good one. Another one that I've heard that's interesting is, every day in the U.S. we have a 9/11's worth of deaths happening from the pandemic, right? But 9/11 we went into a 20-year war over it, and in the pandemic we're just fighting to get rid of the safety measures, right?
And then put the political, the scientific, and the philosophical together and say, yeah, well, we went to a 20-year war over it, but it wasn't. We went to war on soil which did not produce the people who actually did 9/11 in the first place. So we sort of missed the target, and I don't say that lightly. There's so much blood and pain and awfulness and material, and whatever category you want to pick. It's a horror, but it was also misapplied. We know that now with the perspective of years because of political philosophy, because of scientific, whether it's through technological means of gaining information. Technology emerges out of science, its scientific application, and to not dwell on those things is to let them continue to happen the same way.
Right. All right. Well, let me ask you this. So is philosophy a type of science, or is it a pseudoscience, or is it something completely different? We were talking earlier about our words and our boxes of words and things. How do we define it? How do we separate the two?
I think philosophy, again, in my training, in my wandering, philosophy is a large set of subsets of methods by which to probe worlds, whether they are interior worlds or exterior worlds. The methods are the essence of philosophy, and the methods evolve and change. So it's not pseudoscience. It's not always science. Science is one of the branches of philosophy.
Right.
When the scientists who like to deny philosophy are just like the middle-aged people who say, my parents gave me nothing. I'm nothing like them. They were awful to be with, and I'm glad to be well rid of them. There are people who say those kind of things. Or there are people who love their parents and still say, nope, not going to be like that when I get right? Because, so the parent always gets bashed one way or the other. But I think that's a familial metaphor to help understand this. Like it or not, science developed out of philosophical considerations, as did approaches to how we look at art, as did approaches to how we structure our rational thinking. And so it's pre-science, but it led to science.
Right. So philosophy is kind of the foundational bedrock of all human thinking. So like you just mentioned, philosophy influences art as well. So bridging the gap between science and art can philosophical art inspire science?
Yes. See, and I'm answering too fast. I should be thinking, but I've thought about this because we talked about what we were going to talk about. We determined what we were going to talk about. Take a science fiction show like Star Trek back in the 60s. While at the same time we had the most active space program. Well, it was new. It was the space program, the Apollo program. And there are many people who said in the 60s that they were already practicing engineers, that Star Trek influenced them. But moreover, they said that they had read lots of science fiction as kids and they loved all the possibilities. That didn't mean they were going out into space looking for the pulp cover of scantily clad woman who needed the help of the space guy with a blaster in his hand. It wasn't that crap. It was fun, these stuff. It was enormously insulting stuff, too. But the essence of it was, could we do this? Might we try this? How could this? And that influenced engineers and physicists. Science fiction, which is an art, which arises out of philosophical considerations, then had an influence in various degrees on some people who were engineers and scientists who were actually putting technological application to getting us somewhere.
And you can still see that in the language that we use. I've seen a lot of scientific articles popping up recently about warp drives.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
A warp drive isn't a thing that actually exists in science.
No.
It was something that was created artistically.
Yeah.
And then it inspired scientists somewhere to think, is that something we can really do? And to try to put these scientific methods into the application.
So they become normalized.
Right.
When somebody hears in a movie hyperdrive, everyone says, "Oh, I know what that means. It means we can go faster than light and get anywhere fast."
Right.
So the phrase becomes, as you say, a fictionalized trope, which becomes normalized so that everybody thinks they know what they're talking about, and then it becomes, well, we've talked about it so much, can't we make it happen?
Right. Yeah. So I think that, and that example of it, how art inspires science, is kind of a more clear depiction of how philosophy influences science as well. I think that's more what we're looking at, is there isn't any hard difference. There's an osmotic boundary between philosophy and science. There's a two-way street. Mm-hmm. And as we've tried to demonstrate here, you can't really fully separate one from the other.
I think
but
not.
That doesn't make art or philosophy dead, because science has continued to grow as it continued to expand. What's happened is that a lot of the questions that science has answered just open up more questions that science can't answer at this point. And really, that's going to be a continuous pattern, right? We've talked about that in the past. I think I asked you at some point, will we be able to answer all questions? If we had the robot, right? If we had the machine that had all the tools, could we answer everything? And the question, the answer that we came to was no, you can. The more answers you find, the more questions you're going to have. And so philosophy is never going to be dead. We're always going, no matter how many scientific discoveries we make, no matter how many scientific methods we develop, those things are just going to answer questions that will create more questions. Mm-hmm. And philosophy is going to be at the forefront of those. And the most recent article that's been popping up, I've seen a lot lately, is scientists are saying that the universe is a continually self-learning algorithm. Well, if that's not philosophical, I don't know what is.
Exactly so. Yes.
And these are some of the smartest scientists in the world saying it. So they're not acting on just hard scientific data. They're not just using pure scientific methods. Sure, they're using all of the information that they have, but then they're adding an interpretation.
And the interpretation or the extrapolation is the philosophical part.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's going to be people, like we said, who are going to take that same data and interpret it a different way. Mm-hmm. And that's the process of philosophy in science. So, yeah, thanks. It was another good discussion. And like I said, I think we're going to head into, I'm sure that in the future we'll have a whole episode just about science, because I think we've talked about science and philosophy. I think we can talk about the philosophy of science.
Yeah, I
it's
think
a
we
completely
should.
different topic.
Yeah, we should. Yeah.
But I think that there's also some interesting things to explore with, like I said, schools of philosophy. Looking at Stoicism or some of the other ones, and and maybe even delving into human needs versus wants versus freedoms and the concepts of these things. So we've talked about them briefly, but in all of our 50-something episodes, I think that's one of the topics that's managed to escape us in large part up to this point. So
let's do it.
Yeah, so we'll get into it in the future. Until then, keep talking.